my friends, this is Rick, and welcome to Your Seat at the Table. And I want to talk about something that's always been kind of on in my mind for decades, and it's things Kerensky could have done differently along the Exodus road. As anybody who's a diehard fan of BattleTech, you know quite a bit of the history and the exodus of the SLDF after the fall of the Star League and prior to the breakout of the First Succession War. We know those of us have had the opportunity to read or see videos on Operation Klondike, kind of know how the clans functioned, how they got set up, how they had their own problems, their own versions of the Succession Wars, and on and so forth. So we have a lot of hindsight here. We can look back and say, oh, well, if this was done different or if that was done different, how things might have turned out. We wondered, some of us, I wondered, that once Kerensky, war-weary and disillusioned by the fact that so much of the Star League was in jeopardy, and that the House Lords, the other lords of the Star League, did not seem to be inclined in resurrecting the Star League or continuing the Star League in any form that had them other than them being in charge of it. Basically, they had been enough some 300 years, number of their generations, in support of this grand experiment of a unified inner sphere and humanity, and then just had it come to the point where they felt that their pathway, their visions, their manifest destiny was superior to any of their peers and wasn't having anything with it. So they also made every attempt to remove Kerensky from power, to reduce his impact. They fired him pretty much, guaranteed that the Star League was finished. So he made his choice, made his plea to the SLDF, and about 70% of them, some 6.6 million people, boarded these 5,000 odd drop ships, and these jumped and made their escape. Now, I had to ask myself, did Kerensky really have a plan beyond the Exodus itself, beyond leading the remnants of the SLDF away? His high ideal and his high mindset about trying to avoid further destruction. He understood that the inner sphere was going to erupt into a level of war that had never been seen prior to this event, that billions, trillions of people were going to die, and entire worlds would become cinders, and infrastructure and technology lost and destroyed, and so on and so forth. He had this vision, or it just was plain as, the hair on your finger knuckles. It is what it is. So he put all of his effort and endeavors into the great Exodus. But did he really have a plan beyond this? Yeah, he had some speeches. He had this idea of preserving the Star League, the best of the Star League, the best notions, the best ideals. But how to achieve that? How to actually this was going to accomplish? He had this belief somehow, this misguided idea that just this high-sounded moralist mindset was just going to prevail, and that it would all work out in the end, it would take care of themselves? Or did he actually make any serious efforts to try to set that in motion, to guide where this exodus was going to happen and take place? We will never know, because that is not something that's talked about or brought up to date that I'm aware of. What I do know is that we know that the Exodus went on for quite a long time, much longer than what most of the people signed on for or believed they signed on for. So at some point, people started to despair, became angry and disillusioned. There were several mutinies of sorts and growing discontent amongst the fleet. And if you figure that 6.6 million people were crammed into vessels and spaces that were never intended to handle anything significantly of this size, they were definitely short on everything, cramped and in each other's faces, no room to maneuver. Hang on a second. Well, hopefully I managed to pause that right. One of our outdoor cats decided she wanted indoor, was knocking at my door, and yes, you behave yourself. Sit there and warm his coat. I don't need you on the table. All right. So, like I said, Kerensky main goal was the Exodus. Once he got past the Exodus, he went around, tried talking to people, tried gave many, many, many speeches. I'm of the opinion it would have been better for him to have a set of goals. And if he had them, it was never established. It's never been recorded down in any of the lore that I've seen. Uh, if he had come up and told everybody, look, I think we need to take an 18-month journey. I think we need to make 30 jumps. We need to make somewhere in the range of 20 to 50 jumps, but to give them a ballpark idea, look, this is going to be a while. It's going to be painful and uncomfortable, and we just need to buckle down and to endure and take in, and we need to get at least X amount of distance away from the inner sphere before we can start looking for some place to settle. To give these people goals, an idea that this just wasn't some endless exodus into the unknown that was never going to end, because I believe that that worked against him in the long run. Another point I think that I don't think that they really put any effort into. Keep in mind, this is all personal conjecture and opinion. I have no way of knowing what they were thinking. None of us really do. It's never been established in canon or in beta canon. There's no stories about it. There's no lore. I'm only speculating based on the results of the things we do know that occurred during the Exodus and the fallout in the years after they decided to settle in the Pentagon worlds. What I think they should have done was began the process of preparing the SLDF for the eventual demobilization. Somebody in Kerensky's staff had to make that assumption, had to make that comment that we know that the lion's share of this exodus are not going to be able to continue on being soldiers. And when we get to where we're going to need farmers and technicians. We're going to need business planners and merchants. We're going to need shopkeepers. We're going to need everything we had that made the civilization function in the inner sphere and in the history of mankind in general. History of mankind is pretty deep at this point, goes back a long way. There's a well-established hierarchy of what needs to be available for any civilization to succeed. And they could have started laying the groundwork immediately for this. For example, extensive education programs could have been initiated for agriculture, for management, for manufacturing, industrial, technical fields, medicine, both the sciences and the healthcare in general, and the social sciences. The fact that they didn't, makes me wonder. They needed to establish goals for these people, and giving them by establishing these kind of programs and these talks perhaps would have helped smooth the edges out a little bit, would have helped better prepare the average member of the SLDF for what to expect, to get them in the mood or in the mindset of deciding, look, I'm no longer going to be a mech pilot, I'm no longer going to be a military technician. What can I do when I get to the other end and they don't need such a heavily armed military force? Maybe I want to take some of those classes in agriculture. Maybe I should learn up on how to on horticulture, or on how to operate a small business, or how to establish whatever it is. What would I like to do different from what I have been doing, right? I think he did. We know that he did at several points along the Exodus, that Kerensky was constantly in motion. He was going between ships and between drop ships and talking to as many people as he could. He gave those talks and pep talks, mostly trying to encourage them to keep up their spirits. At least this is my assumption. But what more could he have been saying? Perhaps he could have been explaining what he personally hoped they would become, delve into the regional. Maybe they needed to dig into the regional house mindsets that were the core cause of so much of the inner sphere's problems, and how they become united as part of the SLDF in the first place. How these people come to represent all that was best and great of the Star League, and how to continue this belief. Perhaps he needed to begin forming committees or commands, tasking them to envision and design and prepare for the construction of towns and cities, agri-centers, general commerce, all those pesky details that any society needs to thrive. Instead of just waiting to the end of the line and then debarking everybody on these barely marginal planets and just expecting it just to happen, just to take care of itself, to unfold. That this great new Star League revision, or this continuation of the old Star League, was just going to majestically just happen. I don't think it was prepared very well for it. They didn't do the legwork necessary, which is ironic, and I find it kind of disingenuous of such a well-trained, well-commanded, well-educated military machine that the SLDF was. All Pretty much everybody is veteran and elite at this point from all the years of combat and war and conflict, that nobody had the foresight to go, what are we going to do when we get to the other end? Why don't we prepare better? I don't think that Kerensky did a good enough job of sharing his plan or vision for this new Star League, this continuation of the old Star League. And I even question whether or not Kerensky even had a plan beyond getting everybody out of the inner sphere. Once again, I believe that his whole and severe effort first was try to overcome Amorous, restore the Star League, but obviously once he discovered there's no Camerons left to put back on the throne, and he himself was unwilling to become the new Lord of the Star League, he couldn't convince the other lords, the House Lords, to get on board with this idea, and then all of his efforts went into Exodus. Once the Exodus was committed to and successfully achieved, he was at a loss. Personally, I think he was lost. I don't think Kerensky had really given much more thought beyond this point. And once he achieved this point, he didn't know how to proceed. He was locked into this status quo, into this current Exodus mindset. His primary goal is just to keep everybody intact and to keep moving away and to do everything they could to avoid leaving a trace. But for preparations for the future, I don't think he had any clue. I don't think he really gave any thought to it. And I find it sad that none of his command staff and his senior officers and advisors did either. And if they did nothing. There's nothing in the lore that suggests that anybody really set about making any efforts to prepare what was to come next. So my next point, Kerensky needed to establish some form of succession for when he retired or died. Did he, I don't think, once again, I don't think it occurred to him that he was the de facto warlord, the de facto king of the SLDF. He was the house lord of his own house at this point, made up of the SLDF and its forces. I don't think it occurred to him that at some point he's going to have to retire or step down, or what happens if he dies? Was there any kind of contingency put in place to replace him? Who was going to be the natural next in command? Who would step forward? He just assumed that one of his friends, one of his associates was going to do this. Nobody had this discussion. Just did he, in my mind, he could have dedicated people to researching the best policies and programs of the past in order to gradually implement them. Did he expect his vision to simply unfold on its own? Did he expect his people just to continue? He didn't make any plans or preparations. He also needed to figure out exactly where his family, i.e. his sons, fit into this, quote, plan. Did Kerensky intend for one of them to take his place? If so, would either of them even be suitable or accepted by the rest of the expedition? By tradition of the inner sphere at this point, for hundreds of years, these great houses are led by specific families. They're not elected positions. They're not elected by claim or popularity or appointed by fiat. It's a given that the son is going, or daughter is going to succeed the father or the mother and continue leading the particular house. Looking that into mindset, looking at Kerensky's two sons, were they suitable for this position? Were they trained for it? Did they have any experience in it? Should they? It's just assumed. Perhaps part of Nicholas's problem was he assumed, being the oldest son of Kerensky, that he was an inheritor by right of birth of everything that his father had achieved. That this new great endeavor to exodus from the inner sphere would put him automatically in charge. It didn't help that he kept seeing his father live on and on and on with no intentions of stepping down or stepping aside or even formally acknowledging who was going to succeed him. Let's look at his children for a minute. Or let's look at this for a second. Face it, history's best leaders, generals, etc., at best were marginal fathers. It's always been established that this is true. Not necessarily 100% of the time, but the truth is when your father's gone most of the time, and they're important people doing important things and potentially in historic events, and they're far removed from home, their impact on the sons and daughters is marginal or at best, and sometimes counterproductive. And a handful of times when they are home and they try to be that father role, they're ill-suited for it. I grew up with a father who was in the Marine Corps, and his mindset of fathering was more like barking orders and intimidation from his years as a drill instructor. It was very daunting and terrifying at points when I was a child. Just saying, right? That perhaps there was failure in the future, and the failures that came, and the failures that his children participated in and propagated, in part is the failure of the father to prepare for that. We can also use this concept of Richard Cameron as an example. Alexander had been appointed protector and, quote, father figure for young Richard Cameron when Richard's own father died when Richard was very young. And Kerensky constantly being in the periphery following the Unification War. He would, as often as possible, travel back and forth between Terra, but it's a long time. It takes a lot of time to jump and move. It's not instantaneous. That's the thing about Battletech's timelines that we glaze over and we purposely wink and nod. That moving from the core of the inner sphere to the periphery should take months and months. Even if you have access to a great command chain of jump ships, it still take weeks. So other than communications, which are not necessarily instantaneous, it's a problem. So the fact that Kerensky was absent for crucial and critical years of young Richard's life was a problem, and that this opened up a window for a character like Stefan Amherst to step in and fill that void, and to fill that young man's mind full of very dangerous thoughts and ideas, and to gain control over this young individual and help shape and guide him to the point that he did. So we know Kerensky at best was a marginal father, and at worst was a absent father, and was not very good about any of it. Right? He was absent for much of their life. Meanwhile, both Nicholas and Andrei spent better part of a decade hiding from Amherst goons on Terra. They personally witnessed horrors on a grand scale, so you have to ask yourself, were they really suited for leadership? Psychologically speaking, were they? Apparently, Kerensky didn't bother to ask those questions of his own children. Neither did anybody of importance that Kerensky would have listened to. Considering that Kerensky's inability to play the father figure, as example, Richard Cameron, and how it played its part in the failure and the fall of the Star League, this is a valid question. Perhaps these questions should have been asked, and if they had been, would things have gone differently? You know, we know that Andrei, at the prompting of his older brother, helped initiate one of the most terrible mutinies of the Exodus, and they weren't held accountable. Or Andrei was held accountable, but Nicholas's participation was not acknowledged and was not. So Next question is if Kerensky did envision some grand example of Starlink to develop and thrive, and then return to the inner sphere to liberate its inhabitants, perhaps he should have made the attempt to lay some groundwork for this. Based on what we know, Kerensky's main goal, his main plan, was to flee the inner sphere so deeply into uncharted space that no one from the inner sphere could follow them. So intent was he on this plan that he did nothing to establish any means to, quote, keep an eye on the inner sphere. It really appears that he had no intention for the SLDF or its independence to ever return to the inner sphere. Regardless of what his son Nicholas later claims and insinuates and embeds into what becomes clan lore and history. It's a lot of talk. The whole basis, the whole kernel of hope, hidden hope doctrine, if you will, within the nascent clans was this concept that we will return to the inner sphere as liberators, return to a place that has de-evolved into anarchy and dark age mindset. Everything that could be bad envisioned and wasn't necessarily close. Nobody made any preparations. So intent was Kerensky on this plan of exodus, he did nothing to establish a means to, quote, keep an eye on the inner sphere. He should have. Could he have done a little better job? Should they not have set up their version of a watch much sooner? Should they not have laid out the possibility of outposts and listening posts and spies, set up a chain of jump ships that can move this information back and forth between the inner sphere and the nascent SLDF holdings when they finally established them? There was never any mention or inclination of mentioning any of this. I don't think that was ever an intention of Kerensky. I don't think Kerensky ever envisioned ever returning to the inner sphere. His idea was to go out into the nowhere no land, far away as far as possible, and establish a whole new civilization with better, higher morals and standings. And he failed utterly in making any preparations and groundwork for that very thing. So it's not a shock and surprise that within less than a decade, civil war breaks out. Those long buried inner sphere divisions of philosophy and manifest destiny and hubris erupt, and nationalism occurs, in part because the SLDF did absolutely nothing of significance in an attempt to unify everybody. There was, at this point, with all the war and all the fighting and all the conflict and all the suffering and losses that every one of these individuals that went on this exodus had suffered up to this point, you would think that nationalism had been beaten and driven out of them. That just goes to show you just how deeply seated we are in believing our own place in society and place in the larger scheme of things. There's a reason why the hubris of the West is the way it is. And our successes outweigh our failures. And by many of those successes, we are deluding ourselves or disenfranchising ourselves in some aspects. We see this later in Battletech when the successes of the Fourth Succession War embolden Hans Davion. He knows at some point they have a confrontation with House Karita, the Draconis Combine is coming. And in his belief of how well and how his successes at minimalizing House Liao's impact and abilities during those decades following the Fourth Succession War, that he has time on his hands. And when he eventually does initiate the War of 30-39, it's at this belief that they have overwhelming firepower, overwhelming technical advantage, and they're just flat out better than their Korean foes. Yeah, they knew that House Korea knew that this was coming, that this fight was coming. They knew that the Cretan, you know, warlords were doing their level best to prepare for it. They also believed that they had all the cards, had all the advantages. They over-believed in their own hype, and it cost them a lot. Now it's suggested, and I have to, and I really kind of believe this, at the very end of the Fourth Succession War, at the height of the success, House Creta had taken a whooping by Wolf Dragoons and by House Steiner, the Lyran Commonwealth's forces. And prior to the official recognition and ceding Razul from the Draconis Combine to form its own free Razul Republic, had the forces of the Federated Commonwealth pulled up their britches, stopped slapping each other on the backs, turned around and launched immediately into the Draconis Combine to kick the legs out from under House Creta and to cripple them, they would have succeeded. Yeah, it would have been a lot more brutal, a lot more people would have died. The economies of the Federated Sons would have been probably a crumbled wreck, but they would have had the success that Hans de Avion was seeking to get in 3039 that he didn't achieve. So, just saying, right? So in this case, Kerensky set up a lot of the failures for the SLDF, his lack of foresight, his lack of preparation, his lack of asking those questions, his lack of guidance and vision for his now grown sons, come around and bite him in the back and cause even more death and destruction. And a complete perversion of what all the SLDF stood for. The clans are a complete perversion of what the Star League ideals were. And that's the truth. And any people who love and support the clans and their ideals and believe, hey, all more power to you, but that's the truth. And even at the backstory, in the back of the mind of the backstory, for everything that's accomplished since the clan invasion, believes this to be true. This is why the clans cannot achieve victory over the Inner Sphere. They're their own worst enemies. The clans constantly, their own system fails them and fails them utterly. And they're unable to see it. They're unable to understand it. And I think Kerensky was in that same position in his own way. He just simply had this belief that the high morals and ethics of the SLDF and the average individual, the SLDF, would triumph over everything. And he didn't have to make any effort. It didn't even occur to him that he needed to make many efforts to see this achieved. So, not having left any kind of means behind to keep an eye on the Inner Sphere, no spy network, no spy nets. They had all the equipment. They have jump ships or special design warships, that allowed them to do this. They had the knowledge to do it. They failed to act on it, and it was intentional. This leads me to my next question and point. Could Kerensky have done a better job of easing the fears of his followers on the Exodus as the Exodus stretched on? And this kind of goes full circle to my first point when I said that yes, Kerensky did do a number of talks and pep talks. He did do this, but he didn't do a very good job of addressing the very things, the very kernels of what the contention and the fears of the SLDF was at this point. So yes, he did make attempts, as is well documented. He did give many talks and speeches, but did they have any substance? Did they lack from intent? Did these talks come out as a general trying to, quote, boost troop morale, or as a leader whose vision for something better or to pursue the Star League ideals as he claimed, yet lacked anything that really achieved what they needed to? To what end did any of this work? Obviously, it didn't. All these pep talks and speeches and attempts he made fell on. It just didn't alleviate these fears. It didn't. It's this. The lore says it did, and that they kept moving on, but there were still lingering doubts. He didn't do as good a job as he could have, and it's not the man's fault. I'm not saying that the man is flawed, because men are flawed. That is nature. Nobody is perfect 100% of the time. And those are people who think they're perfect and are terribly flawed. And usually other people pay for that stupidity or that lack of perfection. History bores me out. We're seeing that now today in another portion of the world that's, and people don't know how to deal with it or don't want to deal with it, or struggling to deal with our own issues and problems that we're all dealing with today. And it's not the same time. Our 2022 is not 1982. It is not. So, to what end? These were not war-weary troops facing yet more war. These were a people nervous, even terrified about the unknown, both the unknown of deep space and the unknown of what is coming next, what's expected of them, what and why we are here. And we are here now because we believe in our leader, in Kerensky, and we trust that he has a vision and that it's going to go well. Yet we fear that it won't. Without knowledge of what next, without an understanding or at least a basic idea of what the future was to hold, what unfolded next was not unexpected and not without preparation. So too, it was the SLDF's exodus was to be a doomed endeavor. It's not surprising that the SLDF fell apart within a few years. Perhaps it came as a shock and surprise to Kerensky and his core leadership, but many colonization efforts have failed before, even though the probability wasn't from the size of the SLDF exodus. If anything, its very size played a part in its not becoming a complete failure. It was too big to fail. Just too many people and too much resources to be complete and utter total destruction. So much of exploration in sci-fi games, specifically in BattleTech, is a gamble. There's a reason why most of the houses, there's a whole slew of reasons why most of the houses do not continue to expand their borders deeper and deeper into the periphery, in part because the lack of starships, the lack of transportation, the difficulties of communications, movement of material and protecting that turf. And we see the most progressive exploration efforts we see in the modern era of BattleTech would be the Turian Concordat's attempts to expand its borders further away from the inner sphere. But even it acknowledges that it is a great expense, and every possible colony is a failure waiting to happen. Everything from all the possible things that can be found on an unknown alien planet that can kill humans or infect them or render our abilities to produce food or drinkable water a problem, to the very fact that so many worlds, it seems, lack the basic necessity of the ability to produce enough food to support themselves or to have enough potable water. There's the reason why even at the very earliest days of the original exploration period of old Earth, that many worlds required on ice ships to bring potable water in because, yes, they were breathable, yes, they were inhabitable planets, but for whatever reason or another, they lacked that vital resource that humanity absolutely must have. It's the same thing when the SLDF finally makes a decision. The Kerensky says, okay, we have to find a place to settle. So what's he choose? He rushes that exploration phase. They spend so much of their effort and time to get to this point. They get to this point of these handful of marginal worlds. At best, the Pentagon worlds are not the best worlds to settle, but they're convenient. And the SLDF as a whole has run out of patience. They need to settle now, or they're going to be done for. Yeah. Okay. Every now and then I mention this, that I spent a better part of a decade working on a game system. I'm still currently working on doing a version of it that I can publish. I had issues when I had signed a contract with a place called Golden Games, owned and operated by Bell Enterprises. It turned out to be a farce, and it really hurt. And I lost any kind of drive or interest in trying to pursue this game of mine. Anyway, the necessary idea of my game is you're a would-be house lord, and you have 10,000 followers, you have a colony ship, you have a handful of support ships, and you set out beyond the Imperium border to settle your own world and form your own house and eventually your own stellar empire. And to keep you from just keep keep a player from just keep pushing around until they find that perfect world. The game begins on a specific, say cycle 1. Your colony ship only has 5 cycles or 5 weeks worth of supplies at this point. You have 5 game turns to locate a planet that will be at least suitable to colonization. Breathable atmosphere, desired mineral resources, an environment that is not grossly, hideously difficult to construct in and to survive in. And if you reach that 6th turn and have not yet officially hit the button for colonization, making your choice to colonize, your colony will then automatically settle the closest world or moon to it, regardless of the atmosphere or the resources and so on and so forth. And so in my game system, obviously the most sought after world would be a Terran-like system. If you can find a new Earth, you're at a good point. But majority of the worlds are not going to be that perfect. And if you try to settle the moon, an airless void with very little atmosphere or no atmosphere and no water and no oxygen naturally occurring, the build modifiers for such a world is times 10. So if it takes me 100 tons of materials to manufacture a housing concern on a Tech 1 or on a standard world with a 0 modifier, it's going to take me 1,000 tons of materials to do that same housing concern on the moon, because they have to be sealed, it has to be impervious to vacuum and protected from radiation and all this other stuff. There's a reason. So you really want to settle soon. He got to a point where they reached the end of the rope, and this was convenient, so this is where we're going to be. They could have made it a little more effort, spent a little bit more time finding better worlds, and perhaps they couldn't. That's one of those interesting things about BattleTech, if you think about it. There's a lot of parts of the game that we glaze over, we yawn, and we don't care about. Some of those deep mechanics. But the biggest share of planets have flaws in them, and some of them are significant. One of the most common flaws is the lack of potable water, of drinkable water. It's just kind of ironic, right? In my opinion. Anyway, I'm off on a bit of a trance. So it's not surprising. History's full of, quote, bandit kingdoms, and let's get away from everybody colonization efforts that of which fail, either to adversity, internal strife, outside forces, or an environment that just absolutely will not support that colonization effort. Despite its size, and the apparent amount of materials brought along on the SLDF exodus was not a complete and proper colonization effort. It lacked a well-thought-out, diverse set of diversity in skills and mindset. How different could this grand escape have been had Kerensky and his command staff better prepared their people for this? They had 18, damn near 2 years worth of exodus. They had plenty of time to teach a whole bunch of soldiers how to be farmers. They had plenty of time to prepare a whole bunch of technicians to become mechanics, to design and prepare for the manufacturing of agro-machinery instead of battle mechs, tractors instead of tanks. I'm just saying, they could have done a better job, and they didn't. And it's hurt them considerably. This lack of diversity could have been addressed. Could have been, at least an effort could have been made to better prepared. For a military organization that's sole watchword was to be well-planned operations, well prepared for the inevitable or any situation, they fell on their face. I'm sure that if they researched the past experiences that were well documented in their historical databases that they took with them, of all the things of these exodus, these colonization efforts and other from history, going all the way back to woods and sail era of Earth, perhaps things would have turned out much different than they did. Perhaps we wouldn't have the clans. the way we have that. Perhaps there would be this high shining example of what humanity would be or could have been had things not fallen completely apart. And it was doubled down and in your face for Kerensky and his leadership after the failed mutiny of the Prince Eugen. I mean, at this point, Kerensky issues his General Order 137, attempts to justify his actions against the mutineers themselves and to boost morale. But it worked, but marginally. And he should have done this much sooner. He really should have. He should have issued that General Order at the very beginning of Exodus. As soon as it was apparently clear that they had moved beyond the outer periphery of known space and into the true outer depths of deep space, that they were on their own, he should have issued this General Order 137 prior to these mutinous situations. He should have caught wind of what his children were up to, or somebody close to him should have. They should have evaluated not just Alexander or Andrei and Nicholas. They should have evaluated everybody. There should have been. And I'm sure the SLDF had its share of psychiatrists and social scientists who understand how this stuff works. But it's in my opinion that if they did anything, they did very, very little of it. But there's no real documentation suggesting that they did any attempts. So, will we have it any different? Well, probably not. This is how the game played out. This is how our history works out. This is how Battletech progresses. This is how the clans arrive. This is why the clans are. And of course, it would be a completely different world, different game set if something did occur this way. And we wouldn't have nearly as much conflict. Or we'd have the same amount of conflict from a different perspective. Imagine a society of idealistic paladins bent on reclaiming humanity's birthright, and setting right all the wrongs since the fall of the Star League, coming and descending on the inner sphere like the clans did. I don't know. I know I have ideas and another set of notes potentially of what the clans themselves could have done different to see their success in the inner sphere instead of the failure that it was, their invasion, their crusade to claim Terra and this set of ideals and this false ideology that Nicholas had concocted to justify taking over and controlling the SLDF in exile and forming the clans that he did. Perhaps. I mean, let's just briefly take a moment to look at that. So what does the clan's bachelor system do? It teaches them everything can be done with compromise and honor and quickly, so battles can be fought quick. Their engagements, their skirmishes, it's a challenge. We can fight a challenge in a duel. Winner takes all. What do you do when the other guy don't want to fight that way or refuses to do that? Whenever the other side fights tooth and nail to the dirt, to the hilt, I'm going to gut you or die trying. And you're not prepared for that. What about your hubris and this I'm better than everybody else mindset that purposely designed to intend to limit the destruction and waste of your resources, materials, and you discover that to your horror that your opponent has no concept of what that is and believes that everything that they ever believe and hold true and dear is at risk. They're going to fight tooth and nail with everything they have, even if it's a losing endeavor. How much does that make an impact? What if the 18 clans had descended on the inner sphere at the same time instead of the 5, 6 initially, the 8 or so toward the middle and toward the end there, that first before the battle of Tukiad takes place? What if all 18 clans had sent everything they had at the inner sphere? How would that have changed anything? Would it have changed anything? What if the clans had split up, each took a different house? So many clans against Federated Sun, so many clans against the Draconis Combine, so many against Merrick. You see where I'm going. And I hit them all at the same time from different, by 6 different location angles. What if clan hubris and somewhat naive trust in Comstar had never taken place? What if? Till next time, my friends, this is Rick, and I hope you guys have a great weekend.